Michael Douglas, 2 Academy Awards, 5 Golden Globes. A career spanning more than 5 decades that reshaped Hollywood not once, but twice. First from behind the camera, producing the film that swept the Oscars and changed cinema forever. And then in front of it, embodying the ruthless ambition of an entire era with a single unforgettable name: Gordon Gekko. He built empires on screen and off. He turned raw, morally complicated stories into cultural monuments that generations still quote, still study, still fear. The man who declared that greed is good gave the world a mirror it has never stopped looking into. But behind that legacy lies a story not glamorous, but devastating. A hidden war fought on 4 fronts at once: against a disease that nearly silenced him forever, against a son lost to addiction and prison, against a marriage cracking under the weight of fame, and against the crushing shadow of a father so legendary that escaping it felt impossible. The world has celebrated Michael Douglas for decades, but few are prepared to face the haunting price he paid for every trophy, every standing ovation, every frame of cinematic brilliance. A price paid not in dollars, but in hospital rooms, prison visits, and nights of grief too heavy for any spotlight to erase. If the films of Michael Douglas have ever made you feel the electricity of real cinema, leave a like as a tribute to a man who gave the world his finest performances while quietly enduring the performance of survival. It is heartbreaking when the foundation of a legend is built not on privilege, but on longing. When the child of Hollywood royalty feels invisible inside the very kingdom his father built. Michael Kirk Douglas came into the world on September 25, 1944, in New Brunswick, New Jersey, born into a family name that was already becoming mythology. His father, Isur Danielovich, had transformed himself into Kirk Douglas, one of the most magnetic and physically commanding actors Hollywood had ever produced. By the time Michael was old enough to understand what a movie theater was, his father's face was already filling its screens, fierce, jaw set, and larger than life in a way that no child could ever hope to match simply by growing up in the same house. And yet, the house itself was fracturing. Michael was 6 years old when his parents divorced in 1951, an age when a child cannot yet articulate the shape of loss, but absorbs it completely. He went to live with his mother, Diana Dill, a Bermudian actress of quiet elegance, in Connecticut. Kirk Douglas continued his relentless ascent through Hollywood, touring sets, collecting roles, building the kind of celebrity that swallowed everything around it, including the ordinary rhythms of fatherhood. Michael saw his father on holidays. The rest of the year, the legend belonged to everyone else. In Connecticut, Michael attended the Eaglebrook School in Deerfield, Massachusetts, a world of structure, sport, and expectation. He was not the brilliant student that the son of a movie star perhaps should have been. He was restless, distracted by something he could not yet name, carrying a quiet hunger that the classroom did nothing to feed. When he finally transferred to Choate Rosemary Hall, a prestigious boarding school in Connecticut, the restlessness only deepened. He began to talk about acting. His father's response was swift and unambiguous. Kirk Douglas, who had clawed his way from poverty in Amsterdam, New York, born to illiterate Russian Jewish immigrants, raised without money or advantage, had no interest in watching his son coast on the family name. He told Michael directly that the industry was full of heartbreak, that most dreams died in it, and that he wanted something more reliable for his boys. The rejection from the very man whose approval Michael craved most became a defining wound. He would later admit, with the careful phrasing of a man who had spent decades processing the bruise, that he spent much of his early life trying to find out who he was outside of the word son. Not Kirk's son. Not the boy from the famous family. Just Michael. But identity is not something you choose at 20. It is something the world assigns, and the world had already decided what Michael Douglas was. A footnote in his father's story. He enrolled at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where something began to shift. Away from the shadow of Connecticut boarding schools, away from the measuring gaze of a legendary father, Michael discovered that acting was not simply something his family did. It was something he needed. He studied drama with genuine hunger, found mentors who saw him not as Kirk's son, but as a young man with his own presence, his own timing, his own fire. He graduated in 1968 with the quiet certainty of someone who has finally found the one thing worth fighting for. His early career was anything but royal. Small roles, television work, the slow, grinding anonymity of a young actor proving himself on his own terms. His first starring role came in 1969 with Hail, Hero, a modest anti-war film that earned him a Golden Globe nomination for New Star of the Year, but changed almost nothing about his standing in Hollywood. The industry saw the name and thought of Kirk. The critics saw the face and thought of Kirk. Michael was polite in interviews, professional on set, and privately exhausted by the comparison that followed him into every room. Then came The Streets of San Francisco. Beginning in 1972, Michael Douglas spent 5 years playing Inspector Steve Keller alongside Carl Malden in one of America's most successful crime dramas. It was not glamour. It was week after week of grinding television production, long hours, physical demands, and the specific discipline of a performer who shows up and delivers regardless of mood or circumstance. The show earned him recognition. It built a following, and most importantly, it taught him something Kirk had never sat down to teach: that sustained success in this industry is not about brilliance. It is about endurance. But even as audiences came to recognize Michael Douglas on their television screens, he was already engineering something far more significant than another acting credit. Something that would not simply continue his father's legacy, but create one entirely his own. From behind the camera, with a story so difficult to produce that every studio in Hollywood had already walked away from it. He did not inherit the story. He fought for it. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest had been his father's obsession for over a decade. Kirk Douglas had purchased the rights to Ken Kesey's 1962 novel for $47,000, starred in the Broadway adaptation in 1963, and spent years attempting to convince Hollywood that the dark, rebellious story of a man who fakes insanity to escape a prison farm deserved to be on screen. Studios disagreed. The material was too bleak, too politically charged, too far outside the boundaries of what executives considered commercially viable. One by one, doors slammed shut, and Kirk's dream died quietly in boardroom after boardroom. By the early 1970s, with the rights still trapped and the project stalled, Michael stepped forward. He was 28 years old, still best known as Inspector Keller on a television drama, and he had no track record as a film producer. He went to his father and asked for the rights. Kirk's response was blunt. The industry had already spoken, and no one wanted this movie. But Michael pressed. He believed in the story with a conviction that went beyond logic, beyond strategy. He had fallen in love with Kesey's novel in college, when its themes of institutional control and individual rebellion spoke directly to the spirit of the counterculture he had witnessed firsthand in Santa Barbara. He asked his father simply, "Let me run with this." Kirk relented, and what followed was 2 years of grinding, relentless pursuit against an industry that remained deeply skeptical. Michael eventually secured co-producer Saul Zentz, a wealthy Berkeley record producer who shared his passion for the material, and together they commissioned Czech director Miloš Forman, a filmmaker who had lived under the real weight of institutional repression in communist Czechoslovakia, and brought to the film an authenticity no American director could have manufactured. Production began at the Oregon State Hospital in Salem, using actual patients as extras, giving the film a documentary rawness that still disturbs audiences half a century later. Then came the moment that almost fractured the Douglas family permanently. When Kirk learned that the lead role, the role he had owned on Broadway, the role he had always assumed would finally be his on screen, had been given to Jack Nicholson, he was blindsided. He felt betrayed not by Hollywood, but by his own son. Michael would later recall that delivering the news was one of the most difficult conversations of his life. He understood exactly what it meant to his father, how few great roles an actor receives in a lifetime, and how this one had been the dream Kirk had nursed longer than Michael had been an adult. The strain between them was real and painful, a wound that took years to fully heal. But the film was released in November of 1975, and it swept through Hollywood like nothing the industry had seen in 40 years. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest became only the second film in history to win all 5 major Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor for Nicholson, Best Actress for Louise Fletcher, and Best Adapted Screenplay. On Oscar night, Michael Douglas stood on that stage and accepted the trophy that announced to the world, definitively, that he was no longer Kirk Douglas's son. He was a force in his own right. He would later admit, with a quiet honesty that spoke volumes, that he teased his father for years afterward, because Kirk made more money from that film than from any movie he ever starred in himself. The awkwardness eventually softened into warmth, and the rift, painful as it had been, had served its purpose. Michael had proved something essential, not to Hollywood, not to his father, but to himself. The Oscar changed everything, but it did not prepare him for what came next. Because the man who had just redefined Hollywood as a producer was about to discover that his greatest performance, the one that would define his entire generation, was still waiting. And it would not arrive from behind the camera. It would arrive through a character so morally ferocious, so perfectly distilled, that decades later, people would still confuse the actor with the role. In 1984, Michael Douglas took his first true step as a leading man with Romancing the Stone, a roguish adventure opposite Kathleen Turner and Danny DeVito that earned more than $100 million worldwide and proved, for the first time, that he could carry a film not as a producer, but as a star. The Jewel of the Nile followed in 1985. The momentum was building. But the film that transformed him forever came in 1987, from director Oliver Stone, who had not even initially wanted him. The studio had pushed for Warren Beatty. Stone had wanted Richard Gere. Both passed. Michael Douglas stepped in and built Gordon Gekko from the ground up, the ruthless corporate raider in Wall Street, whose declaration that greed is good became the defining slogan of an entire decade of American excess. Stone, testing his star early in production, walked into his trailer and accused him of looking like he had never acted before. A deliberate provocation designed to draw out whatever Douglas was holding back. It worked. Stung and focused, Michael channeled something that went beyond technique. He channeled the accumulated anger of a man who had spent his entire life being underestimated. Gekko became not just a performance, but a cultural phenomenon. The American Film Institute later named him the 24th greatest villain in cinema history. The line ranked 57th among the 100 greatest movie quotes ever spoken on screen. At the Academy Awards ceremony in 1988, Michael Douglas won Best Actor for Wall Street. His salary, which had been $2 million per film, leaped immediately to 15 million. He was 43 years old and at the absolute summit of Hollywood. The same year, Fatal Attraction, in which he played an adulterous husband stalked by Glenn Close, grossed $317 million worldwide and became one of the most talked-about films of the decade. In 1992, Basic Instinct pushed those boundaries further still, provocative and controversial, earning $260 million globally. But behind the soaring box office numbers and the glittering awards, Michael Douglas was quietly paying a price that no ceremony acknowledged. His marriage to Diandra Luker, whom he had wed in 1977, was eroding under the weight of a career that demanded everything and left almost nothing for home. They had a son, Cameron, born in 1978, a boy who grew up in the specific loneliness of a household where a famous father was always either somewhere else or somewhere else in his mind. The parallels to Michael's own childhood were devastating in their precision. A distant, celebrated father, a son hungry for presence, a gap that fame widened instead of closed. Michael and Diandra formally separated in 1995. Their divorce was finalized in 2000. The same year he married Catherine Zeta-Jones. But the legal untangling of their 23-year union would continue for years, eventually erupting in court in 2010 when Diandra claimed entitlement to half of Michael's earnings from Wall Street. Money Never Sleeps, the sequel in which he reprised the role of Gordon Gekko. The case laid bare, in courtroom documents, how completely fame and money had replaced the ordinary texture of a marriage. He had built an empire. He had created a villain that an entire generation of stockbrokers genuinely admired, confusing the warning for a blueprint. He had won every prize the industry offered, and the cost of all of it was quietly building in the one place no spotlight could reach. In his son's life, where a different kind of darkness had already begun to take hold. There is a cruelty unique to fame, the kind that rewards a man's ambition with trophies while quietly stealing the ordinary moments that hold a family together. Michael Douglas had spent 20 years chasing the shadow of his own father, determined to build something that bore only his name, his signature, his choices. He had succeeded beyond any reasonable measure, but in doing so, he had replicated with devastating precision the very wound that had marked his own childhood. Cameron Kirk Douglas was born in December of 1978, the firstborn son of Michael and Diandra, a boy who arrived into a household already straining under the weight of one of Hollywood's most relentless careers. From the beginning, Cameron was a child of contradictions, raised inside extraordinary privilege, yet growing up in a specific kind of loneliness that no amount of money or fame could address. His father was often away. When present in body, he was frequently elsewhere in mind, buried in scripts, negotiations, the endless machinery of maintaining a career at the highest level of the industry. His mother was young and ill-equipped for a marriage that was already quietly unraveling. Cameron would later describe his boyhood with painful clarity. He was a child trying to figure out where he fit, drifting toward the kids who offered the simplest form of belonging. The pattern began at 13. By 15, he had moved further. By 17, he had gone further still. By the time he reached his 20s, Cameron Douglas, the grandson of Kirk Douglas, the son of Michael Douglas, heir to one of Hollywood's most storied dynasties, was carrying a gun in Manhattan and dealing methamphetamine to fund addictions that had consumed everything else. He suffered drug-induced seizures. Friends watched him deteriorate. His family staged interventions that collapsed into silence and rage. Michael Douglas, the man who had faced down Oliver Stone's provocations on a film set and transformed that confrontation into an Oscar-winning performance, found himself utterly powerless in the one role that mattered most. He would later sit beside his adult son in a nationally televised interview with journalist Diane Sawyer and speak with a rawness that no prepared statement could have manufactured. "You rack your brain," he said. "You take it personally in the beginning. You start blaming yourself. And then, with the particular honesty of a man who has had years to sit with the verdict, my career came before my family. My marriage was not great, and so you do hide yourself in your work. I should have focused more on my family." But that is hard to say when you are in the midst of a career. When you are, in your own mind, stepping out of your father's shadow, trying to create a life of your own. In those words lived the entire architecture of the Douglas family tragedy across 3 generations. Kirk Douglas, the son of impoverished Russian immigrants, had built himself from nothing and become a legend, but had been a largely absent father. Michael Douglas, the son of that legend, had spent his life escaping the shadow of that absence, and had become, in the process, an absent father himself. And Cameron, the son of Michael, had grown up in the specific loneliness of a boy whose father's face was on movie posters in every city in the world, except the one where Cameron needed him to be. At his most desperate, Michael reportedly hired 2 men to physically remove Cameron from his environment and bring him to a treatment facility. Cameron, deep in the grip of addiction, became aggressive, and the mission collapsed. The rupture between father and son in the aftermath was profound. They stopped talking. The silence between them stretched into something that felt permanent. Michael would later admit, with a grief that made his voice unsteady, that he had reached a point where he was not willing to emotionally commit to his son anymore. Not out of cruelty, but out of an agony he could no longer sustain. "There were moments when hope dwindled," he confessed. "And then, it is just a train out of the station." Life became a series of crises. "I thought I was going to lose him." It destroys you. It just destroys you. On July 28, 2009, a DEA sting operation ended Cameron's spiral the only way it could have ended short of something worse. He was arrested in a Manhattan hotel, charged with conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine and cocaine. He pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. The sentence was later extended after he was found in possession of contraband while incarcerated, and Cameron Douglas ultimately spent nearly 8 years behind bars. 2 of those years in solitary confinement at the Cumberland Federal Corrections Institute in Maryland. 2 years in solitary confinement. 23 hours a day in a cell the size of a parking space. No natural light. No conversation. Just the unbroken weight of silence and consequence. Cameron would later describe it as torture, and simultaneously as the crucible in which, for the first time, he genuinely began to change. The noise of addiction had always been the thing that kept him from hearing himself clearly. In the absolute stillness of solitary, there was nowhere left to run. For Michael Douglas, those 8 years carried their own particular torment. He was 64 years old when his son entered federal prison. He continued to work, the Marvel franchise, awards ceremony appearances, the occasional film, but the man who occupied those stages was not the same man who had stood at the Oscar podium in 1988. He was a father whose son was in a federal cell, and no amount of critical acclaim or accumulated wealth could make that sentence feel like anything other than an indictment. The symmetry was almost unbearable. Michael had spent his entire career fighting to be seen as something more than Kirk Douglas's son. He had won that fight through sheer force of will and talent. But in his private life, he had become the very thing he had fled from. The celebrated father whose presence in his child's life had been not enough. not consistent, not there when the ordinary moments required it. The distance between them had not been geographic. It had been the distance of a man too absorbed in escaping one shadow to notice he was casting another. Cameron was released from federal prison in August of 2016. He emerged sober, quieter, and with a clarity about the shape of his own life that years of consequence had made possible. He has since rebuilt, a daughter born, a memoir written, a career slowly reconstructed from the rubble of the years lost. At the premiere of Ant-Man and the Wasp in 2018, father and son appeared together on the red carpet. Two men, both marked, both standing. Michael looked at his son and said simply that he was proud of him. The words were not theatrical. They were not polished for the cameras. They were the words of a man who had spent nearly a decade terrified he would never get the chance to say them. What that decade had carved into Michael Douglas was not regret alone, though the regret was real and deep and would never fully leave him. It had carved something more essential, the understanding that the legacy a man leaves is not measured in box office figures or Academy Awards, or the precise cut of a villain's monologue. It is measured in whether the people he loves most survive his ambition. That lesson had arrived at enormous cost, and before Michael Douglas could fully reckon with it, fate reached for him again. This time not through his son, but through his own body. The Crisis, Stage 4, 7 Circles of Hell, and the marriage that bent but did not break it, began as something a man might dismiss. A soreness behind the last molar. A persistent ache in the gum that a reasonable person, particularly a busy 65-year-old at the height of a resurgent career, might easily attribute to stress, to the wear of decades, to the 1,000 ordinary ailments that arrive in a man's 7th decade and mean nothing in particular. Michael Douglas did what most people would do. He saw a doctor. The doctor found nothing alarming. He saw another. Nothing alarming. He saw a third. Still nothing. 3 times, physicians examined the most powerful actor of his generation and sent him home with reassurances that would later carry the specific weight of catastrophic error. It was 2010. Wall Street. Money Never Sleeps was about to open in theaters. Gordon Gekko returning to screens after 23 years, a role that was already generating awards conversation. Michael Douglas was, by every visible measure, thriving. But the ache did not leave. A friend, watching his discomfort persist through weeks and months, urged him to seek one more opinion. Douglas traveled to Montreal, Canada. A physician there looked where others had not. A biopsy followed, and then came the verdict that no preparation, no fortune, no fame, and no accumulated wisdom could soften. Stage 4. Oropharyngeal cancer, a tumor at the base of his tongue, the most advanced stage of a disease in which Stage 5 is simply called death. He would describe the moment years later, standing before more than 3,000 oncologists at the International Federation of Head and Neck Oncologic Societies World Congress in New York, with the particular honesty of a man who has survived something he had no right to survive. When I learned that I had Stage 4 cancer, he told them, I am pretty sure that my eyes rolled into the back of my head. From the little I knew, this was not good. And I think that was probably the scariest moment I faced. He was treated at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City, under the care of oncologist Dr. Jatin Shah, one of the finest head and neck surgeons on earth. The treatment protocol was aggressive. 7 weeks of simultaneous radiation and chemotherapy. Douglas described it later as very accurately mapped to the 7 circles of hell, noting that each week he sank a little lower and felt a great deal worse. He declined surgery that would have required a feeding tube, a choice his medical team warned would cost him weight, but preserve his ability to swallow and taste. He understood the math. He accepted it. Over the course of those 7 weeks and the 5 additional weeks of recovery that followed, Michael Douglas lost 40 pounds. The man who had inhabited Gordon Gekko with such physical authority, the broad shoulders, the commanding stillness, the voice that had made boardrooms hold their breath, shrank into something fragile and hollowed. His face, once defined by the sharp confidence that had made him one of Hollywood's most recognizable presences, became gaunt. He consumed nothing solid. He fought for each day not with the dramatic resolve of a film hero, but with the quiet, grinding endurance of a man who simply refused to give up each morning. Like a soldier, he would later tell that room of doctors, "I prepared for battle. It was my job to toughen up and get ready for the treatment, and later on for my recovery. And that is what I was able to do." But the camera that documented his recovery was not a film camera. It was the unflinching lens of his private life. And what it revealed was a marriage operating under a pressure that would have broken most partnerships entirely. Catherine Zeta-Jones, the Welsh-born actress who had married Michael in November of 2000 at the Plaza Hotel in New York, who shared his birthday, September 25th, though separated by precisely 25 years, had her own private war running simultaneously with his medical one. The stress of her husband's diagnosis arrived against a backdrop of personal struggles that the tabloids would eventually discover and expose. A disclosure that made the most difficult years of their marriage a matter of public consumption in the cruelest possible way. She spoke about those weeks with a vulnerability that stripped away every trace of the composed public persona she had spent years constructing. When Michael was diagnosed with cancer, she told an interviewer, "I really thought you were going to have to wipe me off the floor." She had believed she did not have the tools to cope. What surprised her, she said, was where the strength came from family and friends, from strangers, and from somewhere inside herself she had not known existed. She stayed, through the weight loss and the weakness, through the hospital visits and the liquids-only diet, through the 5 additional weeks of feeling awful after the treatment ended before any genuine improvement could even begin, Catherine Zeta-Jones remained. She would later describe her husband as a very matter-of-fact person, someone who approached the illness as a soldier approaches a campaign, methodically, without drama, doing what needed to be done each day, regardless of how it felt. In January of 2011, Michael Douglas appeared on the Today Show and announced that his tumor was gone. The odds, he said with measured confidence, were in his favor. He believed he had beaten it, and the medical evidence supported his belief. He was cancer-free. His doctors at Sloan Kettering confirmed it. The relief was enormous. The gratitude was genuine. The marriage appeared to have emerged not just intact, but strengthened, the kind of bond that forms between two people who have stood at the edge of something terminal and stepped back from it together. But gratitude, however real, does not resolve the accumulated weight of years, and the years between the cancer battle and its aftermath had deposited something heavy into the foundation of their relationship, something that the relief of survival could soften but not remove. In August of 2013, 3 years after the diagnosis and 2 years after the declaration of victory, the announcement came. Catherine and Michael were taking time apart to evaluate and work on their marriage. No divorce filing, no accusations, just the quiet admission that two people who had been through extraordinary pressure together needed to step back from each other and determine whether what remained between them was still a marriage. Michael would later describe it simply as a little bump in the road, a phrase that carried in its deliberate understatement the weight of everything neither of them chose to say publicly. The truth, visible in retrospect, was more complex. The cancer had tested the marriage, and the marriage had survived the test. But survival is not the same as restoration. The wounds that predated the diagnosis, the distance, the stress, the weight of two enormously demanding careers occupying the same household, had not healed simply because a greater crisis had demanded all available strength. They reconciled in 2014, and it was the cancer, Michael later admitted, that had ultimately made reconciliation possible. Once I started coming out the other end of stage 4, he told reporters, it gave me a whole new appreciation of life. The near-death experience had done what decades of success had never managed. It had stripped away the illusion of unlimited time and replaced it with the visceral understanding that the ordinary moments, the ones most easily postponed, are the only ones that cannot be recovered. He had survived stage 4 cancer. His son was in federal prison. His marriage had bent nearly to breaking. And through all of it, Michael Douglas continued to work. The Marvel Universe, the Emmy Award for playing Liberace in Behind the Candelabra opposite Matt Damon, the film appearances that kept his name in the conversation, even as the private landscape of his life had been reshaped by forces no casting director could have written. But what the cancer and the marriage and the years of Cameron's imprisonment had quietly built inside him was something that no award could measure. Not resilience in the motivational poster sense, but the specific, unglamorous transformation of a man who had spent his life constructing power and had now been forced, again and again, to experience what it felt like when power ran out. That transformation was not yet complete, because the final lesson, the one that would seal everything the preceding decades had taught him, was still approaching. It would arrive not through illness, not through a son's imprisonment, not through a marriage in crisis. It would arrive through the slow, quiet, irreversible reckoning with mortality that no man of 80 can any longer postpone. He was 103 years old, an age so improbable that it had long since crossed from biography into legend. He died at home in Beverly Hills, surrounded by the family that had orbited his enormous life for decades. Within hours, his son posted a tribute that would be read by millions, and that said everything that needed to be said, in the precise language of a man who had spent his entire adult life defining his own identity against the gravitational pull of his father's. To the world, Michael wrote, he was a legend, an actor from the golden age of movies who lived well into his golden years, a humanitarian whose commitment to justice and the causes he believed in set a standard for all of us to aspire to. But to me and my brothers Joel and Peter, he was simply Dad. And then the line that carried everything the preceding decades had earned an understanding. Dad, I love you so much, and I am so proud to be your son. The boy who had grown up in Connecticut, feeling overlooked by a father too famous to be fully present. The young man who had been told that the industry would chew him up and should be avoided. The producer who had taken his father's dream, a story Kirk had nursed for over a decade, and carried it to the stage that changed both their lives. The son who had cast someone else in the role his father had always imagined for himself, and had lived for years with the wound that decision opened between them. All of it arrived in that single sentence, written from a 75-year-old man to the ghost of the father, whose shadow he had spent a lifetime stepping out of, and had only come to fully appreciate once it was gone. The loss was not a surprise. 103 years is a life lived beyond any reasonable expectation. But it was a grief that did not follow the expected shape. Kirk Douglas had not simply been Michael's father. He had been, for decades, the most intimate version of both his greatest obstacle and his greatest motivation. Every award Michael had won had been, in some sense, a conversation with a man who had once told him the industry was not worth pursuing. Every performance had been, at some level, an argument directed at a father who had needed to be proved wrong before he could be proud. The reconciliation between them, the slow, difficult, ultimately genuine arrival at warmth that had replaced the competitive distance of their earlier years, had been one of the most important things Michael Douglas had ever accomplished. And it had happened quietly, away from cameras, in the ordinary intimacy of a son who showed up, and an old man who finally received him fully. To lose that was to lose a mirror. And mirrors, even the difficult ones, especially the difficult ones, cannot be replaced. Kirk's death arrived into a world already transformed by the accumulation of what the preceding decade had taught Michael Douglas. The cancer had been survived, but not forgotten. Its mark lived in his body in ways invisible to cameras, but present every day. In the periodic monitoring appointments, in the awareness that Stage 4 had been a sentence many men do not walk away from, in the specific gratitude of a man who understands that the odds were not supposed to favor him. Cameron had returned from federal prison, sober and rebuilding, and the relationship between father and son, once strained nearly to breaking, had been repaired in the patient, imperfect way that real repairs always happen. Slowly, imperfectly, one shared moment at a time. The marriage to Catherine Zeta-Jones, which the tabloids had repeatedly declared doomed, had endured 25 years by the time Kirk died, a duration that had already outlasted the cynicism of an entire industry of doubters. And into this landscape of survival and reconciliation, in February of 2026, came the announcement that made explicit what the preceding decades had been quietly building toward. Michael Douglas, 81 years old, 2 Academy Awards, 5 Golden Globes, a Primetime Emmy, an AFI Lifetime Achievement Award, a Palme d'Or d'Honneur at Cannes, was publishing a memoir. Its title was not polished into something stately or reverential. It was titled with the directness of a man who had finally stopped managing his own narrative and decided simply to tell the truth. One hell of a ride. Due for release on October 6th of 2026, the book was described by its publisher at Grand Central Publishing as raw and career-sweeping, covering the full arc from the specific loneliness of growing up in Kirk Douglas's shadow through the risk-taking career that had defined whole decades of American cinema, through the private battles with illness and family crisis that had unfolded behind the fame. Douglas himself described his reason for writing it in language that carried none of the promotional gloss one expects from a Hollywood memoir. Not the highlight reel, he said, not the version shaped by headlines or box office numbers, but the real one. I have lived a life that unfolded in public while being deeply private at the same time, and there is a difference. This is about where I came from, what I fought against, and what I chose for myself. Fame can blur the truth. This is my attempt to bring it back into focus. Those words, fame can blur the truth, were perhaps the most honest sentence of Michael Douglas's public life. He had lived inside the blur for more than 5 decades. He had been the villain of tabloids, the hero of award ceremonies, the cautionary tale invoked whenever the conversation turned to Hollywood's toll on families, the comeback story invoked whenever the conversation turned to survival. He had been Gordon Gekko and Hank Pym and Liberace and the invisible boy from the mailroom of his father's legacy all at once. The blur had been total and, at its worst, disorienting, not just for the public but for the man himself. At 81, with a fortune estimated at $350 million, with a marriage that had outlasted every prediction of its failure, with a son who had walked out of federal prison and built something worth living for, With the memory of his father's 103-year life as both a model and a warning, Michael Douglas chose to set the record straight, not to rehabilitate a reputation. His reputation required no rehabilitation, but to do what very few people at the top of any profession find the courage to do, to tell the story not as it played, but as it was. His net worth tells one version. The $350 million figure, accumulated through acting salaries that reached $20 million per film, through decades of production revenues, through the accumulated royalties of films that continue to define cinema courses and streaming catalogs 40 years after their release. Properties in New York, the Bahamas, and Mallorca. A career in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that introduced him to an entirely new generation of viewers as the scientist Hank Pym in the Ant-Man franchise. His appointment by United Nations Secretary-General Kofi Annan in 1998 as a messenger of peace, a role he has continued to occupy for more than 2 decades, focusing on nuclear disarmament and gun control with the specific authority of a man who understands what it means to be watched. But the net worth is not the story. It never was. The story is what lies beneath and behind it. The 60-year conversation between a man and the shadow he was born into and spent his life learning to separate from, to honor, and finally to mourn. It is the story of the boy who felt invisible in his father's kingdom, who built an empire to prove he was real, and who discovered at the cost of his health, his marriage, and his son's freedom that the empire had been built in the wrong direction, not outward toward the world, but inward, toward the people who needed him most. The lesson arrived slowly and expensively, the way the most important lessons always do. It arrived through cancer and courtrooms and hospital corridors and prison visiting rooms. It arrived in the silences after his father died, and in the words he wrote to honor him. It arrived in a memoir named With the Defiant Humor of a Man Who Has Earned the Right to Look Back at Everything and Call It, without apology, One Hell of a Ride. Michael Douglas is 81 years old. The shadow he spent a lifetime escaping has become, in the end, the most honest part of him. Not because he became his father, but because he finally understood what his father had always meant when he said the industry was full of heartbreak. Kirk Douglas had been right. It was full of heartbreak. And Michael Douglas, against all odds, had turned every piece of that heartbreak into something worth watching.